Since we were children, we've memorized a story. A first garden, Eden. A first couple, Adam and Eve. A single prohibition, a cunning serpent, and a fruit that was plucked. We grew up with the image of Eve being tempted, Adam following along, and both being cast out of the place where they once walked with God. That was the beginning of pain, of death, of the loss that Scripture calls the fall. But what if the whole story we thought we understood is only the tip of the iceberg? What if the serpent, the familiar villain, was merely a shadow? What if behind that seemingly simple act was a vast spiritual war, a conspiracy that began long before humanity ever appeared? The serpent mentioned in the Book of Genesis is described as more cunning than any beast of the field. It has no name, no origin, no introduction other than its sudden appearance and speech. There is not a single word calling it Satan, no declaration that this was the devil in disguise. So why, across millennia, has the serpent been equated with evil? Why has its temptation, "You shall not surely die, but you shall be like God," become the source of all corruption? That is exactly what the Book of Jubilees, an ancient text excluded from the Western Bible, tries to explain. In Jubilees, the serpent does not act alone. It is controlled. Another entity, more powerful, more ancient, is behind it all. Mastema, one of the oldest names for Satan. He is not dragged into the story. He is the one who actively asks God for permission to test mankind. And the whisper in the Garden of Eden was not the first voice of darkness, but the echo of a rebellion that began in the heavenly realms. If that's true, then Eden was not only the beginning of life, but a battlefield. And humanity, from the very first moment, was drawn into a war not just between right and wrong, but between loyalty and betrayal, between light and darkness. A war we've never been told in full. If it was only a piece of fruit, no matter how beautiful or enticing, could it truly shake the heart of the first woman? If it were mere curiosity, could it truly sever the connection between humanity and the Creator in an instant? Or perhaps what shook Eve was not the outer appearance of the forbidden fruit, but a deeper dream, a whisper that touched the innermost core of her being. "You shall not surely die, but you shall be like God." That sentence, short yet sharp as a blade, not threatening, not overtly deceitful, but an invitation, a promise, a sweet dream planted deep within the soul, the desire to become more than oneself, to be autonomous, to be self-determining, to self-define. It didn't say, "Rebel against God." It said, "You can become like Him." A temptation clothed in light. And here, the Book of Jubilees takes us deeper. Mastema, the mastermind, didn't use violence. He didn't persuade with evil. He planted something far more dangerous in Eve's heart: doubt about identity. If I can become like God, then what am I now? If I must attain divinity, was I truly made in His image, as declared in Genesis 1:27? And from that, a fracture emerged, not just between humanity and God, but within humanity itself. A question was planted. Who am I? No longer answered with trust, but with a thirst for control. Eve wasn't merely tempted by knowledge, but by a power. The power to define right and wrong, good and evil, light and darkness, from within herself, without reference to any higher being. And when that dream rose up, that was when the first covenant began to crack. Not because of the fruit, but because a voice caused humanity to doubt its identity as children of God, not due to a curse from on high, but because of a decision to believe another promise, a promise of a status that was never theirs. And from that moment on, humanity has never stopped chasing that illusion to become like God, yet no longer within Him. There exists a book rejected by the Western Bible, but venerated in the ancient Ethiopian tradition, a text silent among the loud voices of orthodoxy, yet whispering truths never told. The Book of Jubilees, also known as the Book of the Divisions of the Times, is not merely a retelling of Genesis. It is commentary from the perspective of angels, unveiling a parallel narrative where the smallest details carry great meaning and the most obscure figures become central players in the first spiritual war. While Genesis remains silent about the true identity of the serpent, Jubilees pulls back the curtain. It names the orchestrator, Mastema. It was not the serpent acting independently, not a solitary, intelligent creature in the garden, but a deliberate plan set in motion by an entity that existed before the foundations of the world, harboring enmity against mankind made in the image of God. Mastema does not hide. In Jubilees, he appears repeatedly, not only in the Eden story, but throughout sacred history. He asks God for permission to test Abraham. He is the accuser of Moses. He opposes Israel as they leave Egypt. And most notably, he manipulates the fallen angels, the Watchers, to sow chaos and confusion into the human bloodline. So why was such a text, preserved in the oldest church of Africa, cast aside? Was it too mystical, or did it touch a truth we weren't ready to face? The truth that human history, from Eden to the end times, is not merely a tale of personal morality, but a battlefield of supernatural powers. Jubilees does not simply retell a story, it lays out a map of warfare. In this map, Satan is not a shadow that randomly appears. He is the architect of rebellion, the one who saw the covenant between God and humanity and aimed to break it from its infancy. He did not wait until the 1st century. He did not wait for the crucifixion. The war began from the very first steps in the garden, and the Book of Jubilees is the quiet record of that battle. While many biblical texts speak of darkness through metaphor, Jubilees dares to name it, Mastema, a name that echoes like an ancient voice from the fractured heavenly realms, a title not foreign in Jewish apocryphal writings, seen as one of the primal forms of Satan, not as a defeated villain, but as one allowed to act within the bounds God permits. Not a wandering demon, but a kind of prosecutor in the divine order, rising up to accuse mankind. In Jubilees, Mastema is not only present, he acts with purpose, with method, and the most frightening part, he is permitted. He does not overstep his bounds. He asks God for permission to test Abraham through the offering of his son. He is present during Moses' leadership, doing all he can to cause fear. And from the beginning, it was he who ordered the serpent to approach Eve. Eden was not an accident. It was a test, not born from an accidental fall, but from a carefully crafted plan. His goal wasn't merely to cause mankind to break a rule. He didn't need blatant rebellion. What he wanted was to break the covenant, while it was still young, before it could take root. He knew that if the bond between God and humanity were damaged from the start, every generation thereafter would inherit a fractured legacy. And that's exactly what happened. The descendants of Adam bore not only the image of God, but the wound of doubt, fear, and a separation from the light. Even more terrifying is the way he operates, not in opposition to God's will, but within his permission, as though darkness itself has a role in the plan of light, as though testing is necessary for choice to have true meaning. Mastema, in Jubilees, is not a simple figure. He must not be taken lightly. Because he does not strike directly, he corrodes quietly from within, and at times he is the silent voice in our minds. Are you sure you need God? We are used to calling Eden a garden, a beautiful, peaceful place filled with light and life. But according to many ancient traditions, especially texts like Jubilees, Eden was more than a place to live. It was the first sanctuary, a set-apart space, consecrated, where God dwelled and humanity was invited into full communion with him. The garden was not merely for cultivation. It was a place for worship. Not man's garden, but God's courtyard, where man lived as the first priest of creation. Adam and Eve weren't just placed there as a convenient arrangement. In covenant language, they were created to be the living image of God among creation. Their presence in Eden was a sacred act. God gave them royal authority to govern all creatures, to guard life, to preserve divine order. But all of it was within limits. You may eat of every tree except one. That limit was not to bind, but to signify covenant. You are children, and I am your creator. And that covenant, not the fruit, was the true target of the attack. Mastema knew, as long as mankind remained connected to God, darkness could not prevail. But if that connection were wounded, then God's presence would be hidden, and mankind would become confused, easily led astray. Eden was not just a land, it was the intersection between heaven and earth. To lose Eden was to lose the map back to the source. Every detail in the Eden story carries the mark of sacred ritual. The tree of life placed at the center as a symbol of the spirit. The command, not a harsh restriction, but an invitation to freedom rooted in love. Adam and Eve were called to live as temple guardians, but the moment they forgot that it was God's temple, they began to see it as their own ground. And right at that point, the battle began. Eden was no historical accident. It was the first battlefield where promise, freedom, and identity as children were put to the test. And we, each one of us, from deep within, are still standing at the gates of that garden every day. In Genesis, the serpent appears as a surprise character. No introduction, no background, just one brief description. It was more cunning than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Notably, the Bible attributes no supernatural qualities to it. It is not called Satan. There is no indication that it is a fallen angel or spiritual being in disguise. It is simply a creature, more intelligent than others and able to speak. From this angle, the temptation in Eden can be misunderstood as a simple moral challenge. Humanity defeated by a clever animal. But the Book of Jubilees completely transforms that understanding. Jubilees does not place the serpent at the center. Instead, it is merely a tool, a mask controlled from behind the scenes. The author of Jubilees does not leave room for ambiguity. He states clearly, Satan, here named Mastema, is the one who commands the serpent to act. The serpent did not formulate the question. It did not devise the temptation. It was merely the skin, the outer shell, of a much deeper conspiracy. And this is precisely what disrupts the way we have viewed the first sin. If the serpent were the main actor, then the event would simply be a mental duel between human intellect and animal instinct. But if it is only a tool, then that means humanity is the target of a much broader plan, where spiritual beings are battling for influence. Eden is not a personal challenge. It is the opening scene of a sacred war between loyalty and rebellion, between order and chaos. This reframes the nature of sin. Eve was not just deceived. She was drawn into a spiritual current far beyond human comprehension. Her act, and Adam's, was a response to a manipulation that originated at a heavenly level. And so the story is no longer just about breaking a rule out of curiosity. It becomes a wrong answer to a divine covenant in which unseen powers were attempting to sever the bond between the Creator and His creation. If we understand this, we will see that darkness does not descend like a storm. It arrives as a whisper cloaked in harmless forms, like a serpent, but not truly a serpent, like a promise, but not truly light. Had Satan come with brute force, with obvious evil, with words of blasphemy or direct attacks against God, Adam and Eve might have resisted. But Mastema does not strike head-on. He doesn't need to overthrow the covenant with violence. He only needs to plant a small seed of doubt, just strong enough to shake the foundation of trust. And he plants it not with threats, but with suggestion. Not with coercion, but with freedom. Not with blatant lies, but with a half-truth, delivered at just the right moment, in just the right way, into the most vulnerable part of the soul, the desire to be more. You shall not surely die. You shall be like God. That statement is not inherently deceptive, for humanity was indeed made in the image of God. But Mastema does something more subtle. He leads Eve to believe that to reach the fullness of that image, they must sever dependence on the Creator. He convinces her that becoming like God is no longer a gift bestowed, but an achievement to be seized. It is at this point that the true nature of the scheme is revealed. Mastema does not lie about the consequence. He simply changes the context. He turns the holy into the restrictive. He makes the limit of the law of love appear like a shackle. And most critically, he doesn't need to distort truth, only to displace it from the light, just slightly. Just enough for trust to become doubt, for created to become self-defined, for obedience to become possession. That is how darkness operates. Not by shattering the temple, but by making its keeper abandon their role. Not by tearing the covenant apart, but by convincing humans to slowly undo it themselves, all the while believing they are stepping into freedom. Mastema did not stage a revolution. He sowed a doubt. And the most terrifying part is, he didn't need to appear again after that, because once the seed was planted, doubt would grow on its own, in the mind, in choices, in the next generation, and even in us, if we do not recognize that the same strategy is still being used every day. In many people's minds, the fall began with a single earthly act. Humanity ate the forbidden fruit. But according to the Book of Jubilees, that act was merely the visible tip of an already flowing undercurrent. A rebellion that did not begin with humans, but in heaven. And Adam and Eve, with all their simplicity in the dawn of creation, were merely the next links in a long chain of beings originally made for the light. yet who chose the darkness. Jubilees explicitly describes the existence of the Watchers, angels appointed to observe and guide humanity. They were sent to earth with a good purpose, to help mankind live according to God's laws and preserve holiness in the covenant between heaven and earth. But it was they, the very ones sent to protect, who were the first to be swayed by the allure of twisted freedom. Some of the Watchers, instead of guarding, fell. They were captivated by the beauty of the daughters of men, united with them, and birthed a distorted lineage, the Nephilim, giants who did not belong to the original order of creation. This was not merely a moral transgression, it was a blending of spirit and flesh, of divine power and human lust. A chaos of essence, a rebellion of structure. Mastema, the one behind the veil, was the instigator of that fall. He used the Watchers as his first instruments to breach the protective barrier between humanity and God. And when the gate between the heavenly realm and the earth was pierced, he entered, not with might, but with strategy, not to push, but to plant doubt. In the eyes of Jubilees, Adam and Eve were not the first to choose wrongly. They were the first to bear the consequences of a rebellion that had begun before them. This transforms our view of sin. It is no longer the isolated act of two individuals, but a cosmic wave of resistance, a movement cascading from heaven to earth, from angels to creation. And if rebellion began in the heavenly realm, then this war does not end simply by being cast out of a garden. It is still unfolding in the soul, in history, and in every decision we make today. From the beginning, God did not create humanity to be slaves. He did not give commandments to test them, nor did he establish laws to assert his authority. The law in Eden was not a barrier, but a sacred boundary. A boundary established not to limit love, but to protect the relationship between the Creator and his creation. And in the language of Scripture, that is the very essence of covenant. A covenant is not just a promise, it is a living bond between two parties. God did not merely create Adam and Eve, he entrusted them with the right to walk with him, to dwell in his presence, and to govern the universe as children entrusted with an inheritance. But for that covenant to live, it required one essential element: trust. And that is exactly where Satan aimed. Mastema did not break the covenant from the outside, he shattered it from within the human mind. By posing the question, does God really want what's good for you? He planted a sliver of suspicion in Eve's heart. If God forbids something, could he be hiding a power? He transformed limits into chains, turned the law of love into a question of control. And when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, the first thing to break was not the order of the universe, but the relationship. They did not die physically, they died relationally. The first death was a death in identity. They no longer lived as children, but as fugitives, as slaves to an immature knowledge. They were not immediately driven out by God. It was they who fled from his call. They no longer walked with him in the cool of the day. They heard his voice and hid among the trees. The law had not been destroyed, but trust had. The garden had not changed, but the human heart no longer saw it as home. The covenant had not yet taken root when it was torn, not by a thunderclap, but by a whisper, not through transgression, but through doubt. And that is the very pattern Satan still uses today, to make us forget that we are loved, so that we strive to prove we are worthy at any cost. But in doing so, we lose the identity of children that was always meant to be received by faith. Many believe that Adam and Eve simply broke a rule, that they stood before a choice, right or wrong, obedience or rebellion. But if we look closer, if we listen to the echoes deep within the story, we will see that the real choice was not about action, but identity. Not, should I eat the fruit? But, who am I? And hidden beneath that is a deeper question. Am I a child, or do I want to become my own master? From the beginning, humanity was created in the image of God. That was not merely a description of appearance or intellect, it was a declaration of position. Human beings are creatures endowed with the dignity of sons and daughters, living in love and complete dependence on the Creator. That dependence does not diminish dignity. On the contrary, it is the very source of life. Like a branch connected to the vine, like a child resting in the arms of a father. But Mastema did not attack simple obedience. He attacked perception of role. He caused Eve to no longer see herself as loved, but as restricted. He awakened an ancient question: why should I obey? And from that point, the human mind began to shift, from submission to control, from receiving to possessing. It was at that precise moment that the battle over identity began. A small seed, but one that held the essence of all pride, the desire to become the center, no longer to live orbiting around God, but to push him out and step into his place. The first sin was not just a violation, it was a redefinition of the entire cosmic order. When humans sought to be like God, what they truly desired was to no longer need him. From then on, Eden, the temple of unity, became the battleground of will. Every act that followed was merely a consequence. Their gaze changed. God's voice became a source of fear, not because he had changed, but because the human mind had stepped out of its original position. And from that moment forward, every sin, great or small, has carried the trace of one common seed. I will decide what is good and what is evil, and I need no one else to tell me. After Eve ate the forbidden fruit and gave it to Adam, Genesis records a single, short sentence, but it holds the entire tragedy of humanity. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they realized they were naked. A moment that seems like enlightenment, but was in fact a breaking. Eyes that once saw the world through the light of trust, now looked upon themselves with suspicion, self-defense, and shame. Before that moment, Adam and Eve lived fully in the presence of God. They were naked, but they felt no shame. Not because they were naive, but because there was nothing to hide. No distance between them, and none between them and their Creator. Love was the light that covered everything. But after eating the fruit, the first thing they saw was not light, but their own nakedness. And in that new gaze, God was no longer present. Only fear remained. What changed? It wasn't their bodies. It wasn't the external environment. What changed was their inner gaze. They began to see themselves through the lens of doubt. I'm no longer safe. I need to hide. I need to protect myself. And in that moment, the gaze of a beloved child was lost. Replacing it was the look of one fleeing, fearful of the footsteps of God in the evening breeze. That shame did not come from God. He never humiliates his creation. It came from humanity severing the bond. Like a cracked mirror, the reflection was no longer very good as it was in the beginning, but a distorted image filtered through self-judgment. It wasn't God who changed, it was their way of seeing that changed. From that moment, humanity began to live with a new kind of vision. Not the eyes of a loved child, but the eyes of one who self-measures. And with that shift, the world changed too. From a place freely given, it became a realm to be guarded. From a garden to walk with God, it became a place to flee from His call. That new gaze was the first, deepest, and most enduring consequence of the fall. If Eden was the first battlefield, then the history of humanity is the ongoing chapters. A war not fought on physical battlefields, but within the territory of the soul. And if we listen closely, not with our ears, but with our hearts, we'll realize the ancient whisper still echoes. Mastema has not vanished. He has only changed his tone. He no longer appears as a serpent, but wears the masks of logic, emotion, power, or even the quiet fear gnawing at every soul. Today, no one is tempted to eat a literal forbidden fruit, but every day we are invited to choose what will define us. The same words are repackaged with modern language. You can be yourself. You don't need anyone else. You're not wrong. You're just asserting your worth. Break free from all limits, because limits are shackles. But how many ask, if there are no limits, is anything still sacred? If I write my own law, who will guard me when I lose my way? Mastema has changed his strategy. He no longer sows open rebellion, but subtly stirs feelings of lack, fear, and the urge to control. He doesn't push people away from God through violence. He makes them forget that God is near. He doesn't block prayer. He only needs to make it hollow, rushed, repetitive, and lifeless. And that battle line is not drawn in churches, synagogues, or rituals. It is drawn in the heart of each person. Where we face the choice between surrender and self-rule, between trust and anxiety, between receiving our identity as children or striving to control everything. Eden is not just a location in Scripture, it is a spiritual condition. Every day we live, we take steps through that garden, either walking with God or hiding among the trees out of fear of His gaze. If the story isn't over, then each of us is part of the next page. No one stands outside the battle. Whether you believe it or not, whether you choose it or not, you are already in the midst of the war. And the ancient question still quietly resounds. Do you want to be like God, or do you want to live in Him? Satan does not come with blades, spears, or threats. He does not shout, "Rebel against God." No, he only says one sentence, soft, precise, dangerous. You shall not surely die, but you shall be like God. It was not a call to lust. It was a deeper call, a desire for the divine. And that's what makes it one of the most powerful temptations. It does not appeal to the lower instincts, but aims straight at the highest level of human identity. Man was made in the image of God. That alone is an immeasurable privilege. But Mastema doesn't need to deny that truth. He only needs to make humanity doubt that being image is enough. That likeness isn't the same as being equal. That to be truly divine, they must seize it for themselves. No more waiting, no more trust. They could take it. Now, with one act, one choice. Here we see clearly, the real blow is not to behavior, but to identity. Satan did not tempt Eve to merely break a rule. He led her to question herself. And from that, every action that followed was a consequence. When humans doubt what has been given, they begin to try to earn it through personal effort. When they forget they are children, they choose to be masters, even if that means being cut off from the source of life. You shall be like God sounds like encouragement, but in that context, it was a distortion of truth. It turned a gift into a prize, turned loving dependence into a weakness to overcome. And once that idea takes root, it doesn't just affect the relationship with God, it topples the entire value system of humanity, no longer children who live to receive, but strivers who fight to prove. The image of humanity, which should have been illuminated by the Creator's gaze, was now stained by their own doubtful eyes. And the heartbreaking reality is, in trying to become like Him, they refused to live in Him. That is the paradox of the fall. To seek the divine by stepping out of the only divine communion that ever truly existed. In the common imagination, the forbidden fruit is merely a test, a trap to see if humanity would obey. But in covenantal language, the language in which Scripture is woven, the forbidden fruit was no arbitrary challenge. It was a symbol of sacred boundary, where God marked what was His and what mankind should revere as part of a living relationship. That boundary wasn't meant to restrict freedom, but to keep it from dissolving into chaos. When God said, "You may eat of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil," He wasn't merely issuing a command, He was sketching the space of love and trust. That tree did not carry poison, it carried a message. Remember, you are creation, not the Creator. And when Adam and Eve touched that fruit, they didn't merely break a rule, they rejected their sacred place in the cosmic order. From then on, they no longer lived as children, receiving everything from love, but as possessors. The act of taking the forbidden fruit is a powerful symbol. They sought to own what was meant to be preserved within relationship. They no longer asked, "What am I invited to live into?" but began to say, "I will define what is right and wrong on my own terms." In biblical theology, the knowledge of good and evil is not simply knowledge, it is the right to determine, the authority to judge, a right that belongs to God alone. When Adam and Eve ate of it, they didn't just gain understanding, they declared sovereignty. They claimed what had not been given, not because God was selfish, but because humanity was not yet mature enough to bear it without distortion. That was the moment the covenant fractured, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet decision. From now on, man would live without reference, would call something good by feeling and evil by opinion. And in that moment, Eden, a sacred place, became a foreign land, not because it changed, but because humanity no longer saw it as home. The act of eating the fruit did not merely break the law, it broke the sacred grammar of the covenant, where you are and I am were connected by love. When that bond was cut, the story began to unravel, from a single act to a legacy to all of human history. Scripture says, their eyes were opened, a line that sounds like enlightenment. But the first thing they saw was not God, not light, not truth. They saw themselves naked. They saw each other, not through pure eyes, but through comparison, concealment, and shame. What changed? Not their bodies, not the garden. What changed was the light they once lived in. It went out. From the moment they were created, Adam and Eve bore the image of God. That was not merely a quality, it was an identity. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. But when the light of the covenant was extinguished by doubt, that identity began to fracture. They no longer saw themselves through the eyes of the Creator, but through the distorted lens of fear and self-judgment. They began defining themselves not by love, but by lack. No longer as children, but as ones defending, hiding, fleeing. What happened in Eden was not a simple act of gaining knowledge. It was a rupture in the perception of being. Before that, they lived in communion. They were real because they were known and loved. After that, they began to exist as strangers to themselves, asking, "Who am I?" but no longer locating the answer from God. They became naked beings in the world, not just in body, but in soul. And the most heartbreaking moment, they heard the voice of God, but were afraid and hid. Not because he changed, but because they no longer dared to step into his presence. The first sin did not cut off God's presence. It cut off humanity's openness. It wasn't God who turned away. It was mankind who could no longer recognize they belonged. The fall, in a deeper sense, was not a fall from a place. It was the loss of the light of identity. From ones who lived to receive, they became those who had to strive to prove. From those known and named by God, they became beings who no longer knew what to call themselves, except shame. From that moment, human history was no longer the journey of people living in a garden, but the search to return to that original name, bearers of his image. Mastema didn't need to kill Adam. He didn't need to destroy the body, erase the mind, or remove God's presence. He only needed one thing, to cause Adam to sever the connection with the source. And he accomplished that, not with violence, but with doubt, not with an instant act, but with a suggestion planted in the mind. In the view of the Book of Jubilees, the fall was not a single moment, but the beginning of a long descent, where each step away from Eden was a step away from true identity. From Adam and Eve to Cain and the generations after, that fracture rippled outward like concentric circles across water. Not everyone committed the same sin, but everyone carried the consequence of that original loss. Shame, isolation, the instinct to control, and the longing to be defined by something other than God. Mastema doesn't need to win every generation. He only needs to replicate the same pattern. A replica of Eden, repeated over and over. A subtle suggestion, a counterfeit promise, a step away from trust, and then a lost soul, no longer knowing where it came from. He knows that once identity is distorted, humanity will create new idols, even while still speaking the name of God. And in doing so, covenant is replaced with contract. Love is replaced with negotiation. From there, religion stops being an encounter and becomes a system. Faith ceases to be union and becomes effort. And people, instead of living as children in the house, begin living like hired servants in the very home that was created for them. Every generation must face this wound, not as a sentence, but as an unhealed inheritance. Eden is not just a memory. It is a scar in the spiritual bloodstream of humanity. And only when we recognize this can we understand why the world is so thirsty. Thirsty to be called again by its true name. Thirsty to return to where it truly belongs. And so the great question begins to rise. Will we continue repeating that same pattern, or will we be the first generation to turn back? Because if the separation began with a choice, then the return can also begin with a choice. We don't have to defeat Mastema with might. We simply have to reject the weapon he has always used: forgetfulness. Satan doesn't need to lure you into evil. He doesn't need to scream, to manifest visibly, or to offer grotesque temptations. He only needs a whisper, soft enough to go unnoticed, precise enough to take root in your thoughts. Are you sure you are loved? It's not a direct denial of God, it's a question about his love. And from that moment, the battle begins. Because when you doubt you are loved, you stop living like a child and begin acting like an orphan. Orphans don't wait, they fight. They don't trust anyone will come, so they must save themselves. They have no place to rest, so they build fortresses out of success, control, image, and silence. And tragically, the more they try to prove their worth, the further they drift from their true identity, the one who is unconditionally loved. Satan knows this. He doesn't need to destroy your faith, only to redirect it, away from God, toward yourself, others, or a system. He convinces you that love must be earned, not received. That value comes from doing, not from being. That if you want to be accepted, you must become more beautiful, more capable, more moral. But behind all that striving is a heart growing more and more weary, because no one can win a game where the rules keep changing. And so we become those in control, but without roots. We make all the decisions, but have nowhere to belong. That's when Satan smiles, because he doesn't need to push us to the edge. He only needs to make us forget that we once had a place called home. Sin, in its deepest form, is not bad behavior. It's forgetting who our Father is and who we are in his eyes. When we live as spiritual orphans, every action, no matter how moral, is colored by anxiety, competition, or the need to prove ourselves. And that is exactly what Satan wants. He doesn't need to rule the world. He only needs to make you forget that you are a child created in love, to live in love, and to belong to love. From Eden until today, Satan's strategy hasn't really changed. He doesn't need to invent anything new, because the old script still works frighteningly well. All he needs is to replay the same scene in new settings, with new costumes. Still the same whisper: you're not enough. You don't deserve it. You must save yourself. No one's coming for you. And so, millions of souls keep running through the maze of striving, anxiety, and fear. Today, the forbidden fruit is no longer hanging from a tree. It may look like success, control, image, status, recognition, or even flawless morality. Anything that makes you believe, if I had this, I'd be enough. And just like Eve in the garden, we reach out and take it, not because it looks beautiful, but because we've begun to believe that we lack something. But that sense of lack doesn't come from truth. It comes from a whisper rooted deep since the beginning. Boundaries, which were sacred signs of love, are now seen as shackles. Instead of viewing limits as what keeps us in the light, we are taught that freedom means breaking through them. Break every rule. Don't let anyone limit you. It sounds noble, but if we can't tell the difference between sacred boundaries and counterfeit chains, we will walk out of Eden without realizing what we've lost. And the serpent, it no longer crawls on the ground. Now it lives in quiet thought patterns. Is God really good? If he loves me, why is my life like this? I won't rely on anyone, not even him. It needs no body. It has been internalized. It needs no voice. It has become the voice inside. Still the same old serpent, just a new hiding place, from the Garden of Eden to the hidden corners of the human mind. And if we don't recognize that strategy, we will live our entire lives reacting, defending, striving, without knowing why we are always tired, always anxious, always feeling not enough. The strategy is old, but still effective, because we've forgotten that a battle is underway. And if we forget that, we'll never realize that we left Eden, not because we were cast out, but because we believed we no longer had the right to stay. If you've ever felt not enough, not good enough, not strong enough, not beautiful enough, not holy enough, if you've ever looked at someone else and thought, if only I were like them, if you've ever tried to control everything, your work, emotions, relationships, just because you feared it might all fall apart, if you've ever withdrawn silently, not because you didn't want love, but because you didn't believe you deserved to be loved, then maybe you've been hearing that same whisper once spoken in the garden, not a loud voice, not a great battle, just one small, persistent question. Are you really loved? And from there, you began living as if you had to prove it every day. But you've forgotten one thing. You don't have to become someone else to be loved. You were created in the image of God from the very beginning, before you did anything good, before you made any mistake. You were placed in a garden, not to fight for your worth, but to live in covenant. You don't need to run anymore. You don't need to save yourself. You don't need to seek the approval of the world when the gaze of God has always been upon you, even when you turned away. Stop. Stop long enough to realize you are not someone's failure. You are not a performance score. You are not an unfinished product. You are someone called by name, known in your depths, loved without change. And if that sounds unfamiliar, then maybe it's time to return, not to a place, but to your original identity, a child created to live in love. You don't need to be in control, you only need to belong. You don't need to manage it all, just walk with the one who called you from the silence. You don't need to become like someone else, because you already bear his likeness in the way he intended, and he is still inviting you back to live it fully, truly. The story you just heard may have happened thousands of years ago in a garden no longer found on any map. A forbidden fruit, a whisper, a turned gaze. But what makes it worth retelling is not its age, but the fact that it still continues. The choice, the fall, the trust, the restoration, they're all repeating every day within the hearts of people alive in today's world. Could it be that you're walking through a foreign land too, carrying a vague memory of something lost? A sense that you once belonged, were once called by name, but now only echoes remain. An unfinished promise, a forgotten voice drowned in the rush of life. And maybe something in this Eden story, a detail, an image, a phrase, feels like your own journey. If so, it's not a coincidence. It's a calling to come home, not to a location, but to the state of being known and fully loved. Take a few minutes after this video to sit with yourself. Write down one thing you'll change, or one truth you'll protect. Let this story become something lived, not just something heard. If you're among the few who still remember these truths, maybe you're not just a listener. Maybe you've been chosen to retell, to preserve, to become someone who reopens locked doors, where memory meets the present, and ancient light can once again shine in the shadows of this age. Don't keep it to yourself. Share in the comments. What touched you most? What phrase awakened something in you? Together, we will reclaim what we thought was lost, the truth about us, and about the one who has called us from the beginning. Because some stories never end, they quietly live in the way we choose to live every day. And today's story, where will it continue, if not in your very heart? Amen.